Michigan is the only state in the Union that exists because of a deal nobody wanted to make. In 1836, the territory of Michigan agreed to give up a 468 square mile strip of land along its southern border, land that included the mouth of the Maumee River and what would become the city of Toledo. And in exchange, Congress handed it 9,000 square miles of wilderness on the Upper Peninsula that the Detroit Free Press called a wasteland of perpetual snows. Within a decade, that so-called wasteland would produce more copper than any place on Earth. Within 2 decades, its iron ore would feed the blast furnaces that built industrial America. And within a century, the state that took the raw deal would become the manufacturing capital of the world, a place so identified with making things that its identity, its wealth, its politics, and its catastrophes all trace back to a single, almost compulsive conviction that what matters is production. That conviction did not arrive with the automobile. It was there from the beginning, embedded in the geography itself. 4 of the 5 Great Lakes touch Michigan's borders. The state has a longer coastline than any state except Alaska and holds 21% of the surface fresh water on the entire North American continent. That water shaped everything. It brought the French. It carried the fur trade. It floated the white pine logs that built Chicago. It moved the iron ore and the copper to the cities that needed them. And when the automobile arrived, the water and the iron and the timber and the human capital that those industries had assembled were already in place, waiting. The French came first, drawn by beaver pelts. In 1701, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac persuaded Louis XIV to let him build a settlement on the narrow strait connecting Lake Erie to Lake Huron. He called the place Le Détroit, the Strait, and arrived with about 100 Frenchmen and 100 Algonquian allies to build Fort Pontchartrain. The entire settlement was about the size of a single modern city block. The houses were built from small oak logs chinked with grass and mud. It was a fur trading post, not a city. For more than 100 years, Michigan was a place people passed through, not a place people settled. The French lost the territory to the British in 1760. The British ceded it to the United States in 1783. And the Americans who finally took possession in 1796 found it remote, thickly forested, and difficult to reach. The territory's population in 1810 was fewer than 5,000. Then the Erie Canal opened in 1825, and settlers from New York and New England poured in. The population jumped from roughly 9,000 in 1820 to more than 200,000 by 1840. They called it Michigan Fever. Statehood came in 1837, but not without a fight that tells you more about the character of this place than any founding document could. The fight was over Toledo. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had drawn the border between what would become Michigan and Ohio along a line running east from the southern tip of Lake Michigan. The trouble was that the maps were wrong. Nobody in 1787 knew exactly where the southern tip of Lake Michigan was, and by the time surveyors figured it out, the line it implied would have given Michigan a strip of land that Ohio had already claimed, including the mouth of the Maumee, which everyone could see was going to be important for commerce. Ohio was already a state. Michigan was still a territory. President Andrew Jackson sided with Ohio, the state that could deliver electoral votes, and told Michigan it could have statehood and the Upper Peninsula, or it could have nothing. Michigan's territorial governor, Stevens T. Mason, was 22 years old, and he sent the militia south toward Toledo. The so-called Toledo War produced exactly one casualty, a Michigan sheriff stabbed with a penknife, and a great deal of shouting in newspapers and legislative chambers. In the end, Michigan buckled. A convention held in December 1836, in weather so bitter it earned the name the Frostbitten Convention, voted to accept the deal. Michigan entered the Union as the 26th state on January 26, 1837, in possession of 9,000 square miles it did not want. 3 years later, a 29-year-old geologist named Douglas Houghton stepped onto a barge on Lake Superior to begin the first geological survey of the Keweenaw Peninsula, a narrow finger of land jutting into the lake from the Upper Peninsula's northwest shore. What Houghton found changed the state's future. Beneath the forests and volcanic rock of the Keweenaw lay deposits of native copper. Not copper ore that needed smelting, but pure metallic copper, the kind you could pull from the rock and shape without a furnace. Native Americans had mined it for at least 5,000 years. Houghton's 1841 report set off the country's first mineral rush, 2 years before the California gold rush would capture the national imagination. By 1845, the Cliff Mine was in operation, and prospectors and mining companies were flooding into a wilderness that had no roads, no railroads, and winters that dropped 10 feet of snow. More than 400 companies staked claims. Most failed. The ones that survived, the Quincy, the Calumet, and Hecla, the Copper Range, became enormously profitable. From 1845 to 1887, Michigan's copper country was the nation's leading producer. In most years between 1850 and 1881, Michigan produced more than 3/4 of all the copper mined in the United States. In 1869, it produced more than 95%. By the time the mines finally closed in the late 1960s, more than 14 billion pounds of copper had been extracted from the Keweenaw. The boomtown of Calumet, originally called Red Jacket, grew so fast that it was briefly considered as a candidate for the state capital. Today its population is about 700, but copper was only half of what the Upper Peninsula held. In 1844, a surveyor named William Burt was running a line near Negaunee when his compass needle began spinning wildly. He had stumbled onto the Marquette Iron Range, and the discovery would reshape the American economy. Iron ore was found in 3 great ranges across the Upper Peninsula: the Marquette, the Menominee, and the Gogabic, and the quantities were staggering. Between 1854 and the 1970s, the Michigan portion of these ranges produced well over 1 billion tons of usable iron ore. That ore fed the blast furnaces in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Gary, and Chicago. It became the steel in the railroad tracks that crossed the continent, the beams in the skyscrapers that defined the American skyline, and eventually the bodies of the automobiles that would make Michigan the most consequential manufacturing state in the country. Getting the ore out, however, required solving an enormous infrastructure problem. Lake Superior sits 21 feet higher than the other Great Lakes, and the St. Mary's River connecting it to Lake Huron drops over a set of rapids at Sault Ste. Marie that made navigation impossible for any ship carrying cargo. For years, everything that moved between Lake Superior and the lower lakes had to be unloaded, hauled overland around the rapids, and loaded onto a different ship. When Michigan asked Congress for help building a canal and locks, a senator from the South dismissed the idea, saying the Upper Peninsula was beyond the remotest settlement in the United States, and that building a canal there was like building one on the moon. The locks were built anyway. The state locks opened on June 18, 1855, and the steamer Illinois became the first vessel to pass through. That first summer, the locks moved about 1,500 tons of iron ore. 5 years later, the figure was 120,000 tons. By the turn of the century, the Soo Locks, as they came to be called, were handling tens of millions of tons annually. By mid-century, more tonnage passed through the Soo Locks each year than through the Panama, Suez, and Manchester canals combined. They were and remain among the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure in North America, a choke point through which virtually all of the continent's domestically mined iron ore must pass. The federal government took control in the 1870s, and to this day, the Army Corps of Engineers operates them toll-free, 24 hours a day, for a 9-month shipping season. While copper and iron were being torn from the Upper Peninsula, a different extraction was consuming the lower. Michigan's northern counties were covered in white pine, trees 200 feet tall, 5 feet in diameter, 200 years old. The pine stands seemed inexhaustible. Early surveyors estimated 150 billion board feet. By the time the historians counted what had actually been cut, the number was closer to 160 billion board feet of pine alone, plus another 50 billion in cedar, hemlock, and hardwoods. Between roughly 1860 and 1900, Michigan was the leading lumber-producing state in the nation. By 1880, it was producing as much lumber as the next 3 states combined. The operation ran on water. Lumber camps worked the winter, felling trees and hauling logs by sled to frozen riverbeds. When the spring thaw came, the rivers carried the logs downstream to the sawmills. 6 rivers converged to form the Saginaw River, which empties into Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron, and this made Saginaw the center of the early lumber industry. Muskegon, on the Lake Michigan side, was another mill town of enormous output. The lumber barons, Men like Charles Hackley in Muskegon and the Blodgett and Herkimer families in Grand Rapids became fantastically wealthy, and some of them reinvested in the communities they had stripped bare, endowing libraries, hospitals, and schools. Others simply moved on. By the early 1890s, most of Michigan's pine was gone. The loggers had cut it in about 30 years. The lumber companies packed up and headed to the Pacific Northwest. What they left behind was devastation. The cut-over land, millions of acres of stumps and slash, the discarded tops and branches of felled trees, was a fire hazard on an almost unimaginable scale. In 1871, the same year as the Great Chicago Fire, flames swept through the forests of the Thumb region of eastern Michigan, burning over 1 million acres and killing at least 200 people. A decade later, in 1881, an even larger fire struck the same region, burning over 1 million acres again and leaving thousands homeless. These fires were not natural disasters in the ordinary sense. They were the predictable consequence of an extraction economy that took everything and left the debris. The state's response over time was to begin replanting and to establish what would become one of the largest state forest systems in the country. But the virgin white pine was gone, and it was never coming back. The lumber era left Michigan with something besides stumps, though. It left infrastructure, railroads in particular, that had been built to haul logs but now connected towns across the state. It left skilled laborers who knew how to work with metal and wood. It left a population of immigrants, Finns, Cornish miners, Scandinavians, Irish, French Canadians, who had come for the mines and the mills and stayed. And it left capital, concentrated in the hands of men in Detroit and Grand Rapids and Saginaw, who were looking for the next thing to invest in. The next thing turned out to be the horseless carriage. Michigan did not invent the automobile, but it did something more consequential. It figured out how to make automobiles in enormous quantities, cheaply enough that ordinary people could buy them. The reasons Michigan became the center of the auto industry are debated, but the convergence of factors is not. It had timber for the early car bodies, iron and steel nearby, a network of machine shops and carriage makers, access to waterborne shipping, a pool of skilled labor from the mining and lumber industries, and available capital. It also had a culture of tinkering, of practical engineering, of making things work, a disposition that seems to run through the entire history of the state. Ransom Eli Olds got there first. Born in Ohio but raised in Lansing, where his father ran a machine shop, Olds built his first gasoline-powered car in 1896 and founded the Olds Motor Works in 1897. His curved-dash Oldsmobile, introduced in 1901, was the first mass-produced automobile in America. Olds used a stationary assembly line, not yet a moving one, but a system of standardized parts and organized stations that allowed workers to build cars at a pace nobody had seen before. He sold 600 cars in 1901 and 5,000 by 1904. Lansing, not Detroit, was briefly the center of the automobile universe. Then Henry Ford arrived. Ford was a farm boy from Dearborn, born in 1863, who had walked 8 miles to Detroit at 16 to find work as a machinist's apprentice. He built his first car in 1896, failed at his first company, and founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903. He was not the first automaker, but he was the one who understood with a clarity that bordered on obsession that the automobile had to become cheap. His Model T, introduced in 1908, was a sturdy, simple, affordable machine. And Ford spent the next 2 decades finding ways to make it cheaper still. In 1913, at the Highland Park plant designed by the architect Albert Kahn, Ford introduced the moving assembly line. The time required to assemble a Model T chassis dropped from 12.5 hours to 93 minutes. The price of the car fell year after year, from $850 in 1908 to under $300 by the mid-1920s. On January 5, 1914, Ford did something that stunned the industrial world. He announced that Ford Motor Company would pay its workers $5 a day, more than double the prevailing wage for unskilled factory labor. The Wall Street Journal called him a class traitor. Other industrialists were furious. Workers were ecstatic. The $5 day was not pure altruism. Ford's turnover rate had been running at 300 to 400% annually, and the monotony of the assembly line was driving men away faster than they could be replaced. The higher wage cut turnover dramatically, boosted productivity, and, Ford understood, created customers. A man making $5 a day could buy the car he was building. The announcement transformed Detroit. Within days, thousands of men from across the country descended on the city, looking for work at Ford. Many of them came from the rural South. The first wave was predominantly white, but beginning during World War I and accelerating through the 1920s, African Americans from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Tennessee followed the railroad lines north to Detroit in what became one of the defining movements of the 20th century, the Great Migration. Ford was, despite his many failings, one of the first major industrialists to hire black workers in significant numbers, and the wage differential was enormous. $5 a day versus the $5 a month that many black workers earned in the sharecropping South. Detroit's African American population surged from fewer than 6,000 in 1910 to more than 40,000 by 1920, an increase of over 600% in a single decade. By 1930, it had tripled again. By 1970, more than 660,000 black residents lived within the city limits. They arrived in a city that was being remade by the automobile at a speed that is difficult to comprehend today. In 1900, Detroit's population was about 285,000. By 1920, it was nearly 1 million. By 1930, it was 1.6 million. The city had become the fourth largest in the United States, and it had gotten there in 20 years. In the first decade of the 20th century alone, more than 125 automotive companies were founded in Detroit. Most failed. The survivors consolidated. William C. Durant, a restless dealmaker from Flint, founded General Motors in 1908 by acquiring Buick, then Oldsmobile, then Cadillac, then dozens of others. Walter Chrysler, who had learned the business at General Motors before being pushed out, founded the Chrysler Corporation in 1925. By 1940, 60% of the world's automobiles were assembled in Michigan, and nearly all passenger car manufacturers had plants within 250 miles of Detroit. Flint was the company town that General Motors built. By the 1930s, GM was the largest corporation on earth, and Flint was its workshop. Nearly every working adult in the city depended, directly or indirectly, on General Motors. The concentration of power was suffocating. Workers had no voice, no protection, and no leverage until the winter of 1936. On December 30th, workers at GM's Fisher Body Plant No. 1 in Flint saw critical die-making equipment being loaded onto railroad cars, bound for factories in other cities where the union was weaker. Word spread that GM was trying to move production away from the union stronghold. That night, workers flooded back into the plant, not to work, but to stay. They sat down. They refused to leave. For 44 days, through the coldest part of a Michigan winter, the men occupied the plant, sleeping on car seats and sheepskin, eating food sent in by their families and sympathizers, playing cards and ping pong on the silent factory floor. Women organized the emergency brigade, forming human shields around the plant when police tried to intervene. Governor Frank Murphy sent in the National Guard, not to evict the strikers, but to keep the peace. On February 11, 1937, General Motors signed a contract recognizing the United Auto Workers as the sole bargaining agent for its employees. It was the most consequential labor victory in American history. The UAW went from a marginal organization to one of the most powerful unions in the country, and within a few years, every major automaker had unionized. The contract that came out of Flint, with its provisions for seniority, grievance procedures, and eventually health insurance and pensions, became the template for industrial labor relations in America for the next half-century. The sit-down strike established something that would define Michigan for generations, a compact between labor and capital, negotiated through force and sustained through mutual dependence. The auto companies needed workers. The workers needed the companies. The state government, caught between them, mediated, taxed, and distributed. For 3 decades, from the late 1930s through the late 1960s, This arrangement produced the highest standard of living for working-class people that the world had ever seen. A man with a high school education could walk into a GM or Ford or Chrysler plant, join the union, and earn enough to buy a house, a car, and a summer cottage up north. He could send his children to the University of Michigan or Michigan State. He could retire with a pension. It was not utopia. The racial covenants, the housing discrimination, the violent policing of black neighborhoods made that clear enough. But as a pure economic proposition, for the people it included, it worked. Then the war came, and Michigan showed what it could do when the entire apparatus of production was pointed at a single objective. President Roosevelt called American industry the arsenal of democracy, and he was talking, more than anywhere else, about Michigan. The auto factories retooled. The Chrysler Corporation built the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in Warren, and within a year of its dedication, it had produced its 2,000th tank. In December 1942, the Arsenal's 5,000 workers set an all-time monthly record by turning out 907 Sherman tanks. By the war's end, Chrysler had built more than 22,000 tanks at that single plant. But the most extraordinary achievement was Willow Run. In 1941, Ford Motor Company began clearing farmland near Ypsilanti, about 30 miles from Detroit, to build the largest factory in the world, a plant designed to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers on an assembly line, something that had never been attempted. The main building covered more than 7 million square feet. Albert Kahn designed it. 40,000 workers, including women who became the real-life models for Rosie the Riveter, staffed the operation. The early months were rocky. Critics called it "Will It Run?" But by 1944, the plant was producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes. By the war's end, Willow Run had built 8,685 B-24s. In the first 18 months after Pearl Harbor alone, 350,000 people migrated to Detroit to work in defense plants. Automakers and their suppliers produced $30 billion worth of military equipment between 1942 and 1945. The war cemented Michigan's identity as the place that made things, and it papered over fractures that had been widening for years. The great wave of black migration during the war years collided with a rigid system of housing segregation. In 1943, racial violence erupted in Detroit, killing 34 people. 25 of the dead were black, and 17 of those were killed by police. The riot was suppressed, the factories went back to work, and the underlying conditions, overcrowded black neighborhoods, whites-only suburbs enforced by restrictive covenants and mortgage redlining, a police force that treated black Detroiters as an occupying army would, remained exactly as they were. After the war, the auto industry entered what looked like permanent prosperity. New models every year, bigger engines, tail fins. The interstate highway system, authorized by Eisenhower in 1956, was the greatest subsidy the automobile industry would ever receive. A 41,000-mile network of high-speed roads, built with federal dollars, that made the car not just convenient, but necessary. Michigan boomed. The suburbs sprawled outward from Detroit in every direction. Dearborn, Warren, Livonia, Troy, Southfield. And the new highways made it possible to live 20 or 30 miles from the plant and drive to work. In 1957, the Mackinac Bridge opened, connecting Michigan's two peninsulas for the first time by road. The 5-mile suspension bridge, designed by David B. Steinman and built at a cost of $100 million, was the longest of its kind in the world when it was completed. For decades, the Upper Peninsula had been reachable from the lower only by ferry, a journey that could take hours during summer backups and was impossible during winter ice. The bridge, paid for by toll revenue and bond financing rather than federal money, was Michigan's declaration that it was one state, not two, though anyone who has crossed the Straits of Mackinac knows that the Upper Peninsula is, in culture, economy, and temperament, a place apart. But even as the bridge was being dedicated, the forces that would hollow out Michigan's industrial core were already in motion. The auto companies had begun decentralizing during the war, building plants in the Midwest and the South where labor was cheaper and unions weaker. Automation was eliminating assembly line jobs. The interstate highways that sold cars also drained the cities. White families moved to the suburbs, taking their tax revenue with them, and the commercial districts that had sustained urban neighborhoods withered. Between the late 1940s and the 1960s, the restructuring of the auto industry accelerated. Jobs that had required human hands were done by machines. Plants that had been in Detroit moved to places where land was cheap and unions had less leverage. In 1967, Detroit erupted again. The uprising that began on 12th Street on July 23rd lasted 5 days, left 43 people dead, and destroyed hundreds of buildings. Federal troops and the National Guard occupied the city. The immediate cause was a police raid on an after-hours club, but the underlying causes were the same ones that had been accumulating for decades. Segregated housing, discriminatory hiring, a poisonous relationship between the police and black residents, and an economy that had been slowly withdrawing opportunity from the people who needed it most. The 1967 uprising accelerated a migration that was already underway. White residents left Detroit in enormous numbers. Between 1950 and 2010, the city lost more than 1.1 million people, a decline of over 60%. In 1950, Detroit's population had been 1.85 million, and the city was 82% white. By the time of the 2010 census, the population was about 700,000, and the city was 82% black. The numbers tell a story of almost perfect inversion, and they tell it not just about Detroit, but about the entire state. Michigan's population growth, which had been explosive from 1910 through 1960, slowed to a crawl in the 1970s and essentially flatlined after that. The state's economy, built on manufacturing, was being disassembled by the same forces of globalization and automation that were transforming every industrial economy in the world. But Michigan felt it worse because it was more dependent on a single industry than almost any other state. The oil crisis of 1973 hit Michigan like a blow to the chest. Gas prices quadrupled, and suddenly the big American cars that Detroit had been building for decades, the land yachts, the V8S, the chrome-laden symbols of post-war abundance, were unsellable. Japanese manufacturers, making smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, captured market share at a pace that terrified the Big Three. Layoffs cascaded through the supply chain. Towns like Flint, which had been built entirely around General Motors, began a decline from which they have never recovered. In 1960, Flint's population was nearly 200,000. Today, it is under 100,000, and large portions of the city are physically vacant, houses torn down or crumbling, lots returned to grass and trees, an urban landscape being slowly reclaimed by the land beneath it. The story of Michigan from the 1970s onward is a story of contraction, but it is also a story of attempts to find new footing, and those attempts reveal the same impulse toward production that had driven the state since the beginning. Grand Rapids, on the western side of the state, had built its economy on furniture manufacturing. It was once called Furniture City, and companies like Steelcase and Herman Miller made it a global center for office furniture design. When traditional manufacturing declined, Grand Rapids pivoted toward healthcare, education, and a modest tech sector. It became one of the few Michigan cities whose downtown filled up rather than emptied out. The west side of the state, oriented more toward Lake Michigan and the agricultural counties of the Fruit Belt, cherries, blueberries, wine grapes, had never been as dependent on the auto industry as the east, and it weathered the decline differently. Battle Creek, in the southwestern part of the state, had its own peculiar story. In the early 1900s, it was the cereal capital of the world. More than 80 cereal companies operated there at the peak. The Kellogg brothers invented flaked cereal. C.W. Post, a former patient at the Kellogg Sanitarium, launched a rival company down the road. Most of the 80 companies vanished. Kellogg endured for more than a century. The story of Battle Creek is the story of what happens when an entire city's identity is fused to a single product, and what happens when the company that makes it begins to drift away. Ann Arbor remained what it had been since the founding of the University of Michigan in 1817, a college town with unusual economic resilience. The university generated billions in research funding and anchored a local economy that had more in common with Cambridge than with Flint. Michigan State in East Lansing played a similar role. For the people who know these schools through their football teams and alumni networks, The universities are more than economic engines. They are the places where Michigan's identity is reproduced, generation after generation. Lansing, the state capital, was itself a product of political calculation. In 1847, the legislature moved the capital from Detroit to what was then a sawmill and a log cabin in the woods, a deliberate choice to plant the seat of government far from Detroit's economic dominance. Lansing grew modestly, anchored by state government and later by Ransom Olds' automobile factories. But the real center of power was always Detroit. The relationship between Michigan and the federal government has always been about the auto industry. Federal highways built the roads that sold the cars. Federal defense contracts kept the factories running. And when the financial crisis of 2008 hit, General Motors and Chrysler were both on the edge of collapse. The federal government stepped in with one of the largest bailouts in the history of American capitalism, roughly $50 billion for GM, over $12 billion for Chrysler. The bailout saved hundreds of thousands of jobs, but it also confirmed what everyone already knew. Michigan's economy was tethered to decisions made in Washington and to markets that no state policy could control. Then came Detroit's own bankruptcy. On July 18, 2013, the city filed for Chapter 9 protection, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, with debts estimated between $18 and $20 billion. The city's revenue had fallen more than 20% from its 2008 level. Its population had been declining for 6 decades. Property values had cratered. The city could not maintain basic services. Streetlights went dark over entire neighborhoods. Police response times stretched beyond an hour, and the fire department was running trucks so old they broke down on the way to fires. An emergency manager appointed by the governor under a state law that itself had been the subject of bitter political controversy oversaw the restructuring. About $7 billion in debt was eliminated or renegotiated. The city's pension obligations were cut. The Detroit Institute of Arts, which held a collection valued in the billions, was nearly forced to sell its holdings to pay creditors. A consortium of foundations and the state government assembled a deal called the Grand Bargain that contributed over $800 million to shore up the pensions in exchange for keeping the art collection intact and transferring it to an independent trust. The city exited bankruptcy in December 2014. The Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island still stands on its bluff above the straits. Its porch, the longest in the world, stretching 660 feet along the ridgeline. It was built in 1887, in 93 days, by the Michigan Central Railroad and the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad, constructed from Michigan white pine, a palace for the tourists who were arriving by steamship and rail to vacation in northern Michigan. No automobiles have ever been allowed on Mackinac Island. The hotel was built by the industries that preceded the car and is preserved in part by the prohibition of the one that replaced them. The irony would be too neat if it were intentional, but it is not intentional. It is simply what Michigan does. It builds something enormous, it extracts everything it can, and it moves on to the next thing, leaving behind structures so solid they outlast the economies that created them. The Keweenaw Peninsula is quiet now. The last copper mine closed in 1968. The towns that once held thousands of people, Calumet, Hancock, Houghton, are small, remote, and cold. Michigan Technological University, founded in 1885 as the Michigan Mining School to train the engineers the copper industry needed, remains in Houghton, offering degrees in engineering to students who arrive in a place where the average annual snowfall exceeds 200 inches. The mine shafts are sealed or flooded. The company houses still stand in rows along the streets. The Opera House in Calumet, built in 1900 when the town was flush with copper money, seats over 1,000 and still hosts performances. The architecture is the residue of an economy that came, produced spectacularly, and vanished. At the Soo Locks, the ore boats still come through. Enormous lake freighters, 1,000 feet long, riding low in the water under loads of iron pellets. An average of 80 million tons of cargo passes through each year, toll-free, maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers. During World War II, the Army stationed troops around the locks and installed anti-aircraft guns, reasoning that a single successful attack could cripple American steel production and, with it, the war effort. The story of Michigan is not the generic American arc of rise and decline. It is something more specific and more instructive. It is the story of a state that discovered again and again that it was sitting on something valuable: fur, copper, iron, timber, a strategic waterway, a concentration of mechanical skill, and that each time it built an industry so large and so dominant that the state's identity became inseparable from the thing it produced. And each time, when the resource ran out or the market shifted or the technology changed, the transition was brutal because the investment had been so total. Michigan did not diversify the way states with less spectacular resources were forced to. It did not need to. The copper gave way to timber. The timber gave way to iron. The iron gave way to automobiles. And each transition was so productive that the previous loss was, for a time, forgotten. The automobile was the last great wave, and it lasted longer than any of the others. Long enough that it became not just an industry, but a way of life, a class structure, a political alignment, a set of assumptions about what work was, who did it, and what it was worth. When that wave receded, there was no next thing of equal magnitude waiting. The state that had always found the next deposit, the next stand of timber, the next manufacturing breakthrough, was left with the same assets it had always had: the water, the land, the universities, the people, and the question of what to do with them. The white pine is gone, but Michigan is more forested now than it was a century ago. Second-growth trees cover the north, and the state forest system encompasses nearly 4 million acres. The forests are not what they were, but the land has recovered in a way that would have seemed impossible to anyone who saw the charred, stump-covered wasteland of the 1890s. Detroit's population, after 6 decades of decline, ticked upward in the 2022 census estimates for the first time since the 1950s. More than 25,000 blighted houses have been demolished since the bankruptcy. Whether this represents a genuine reversal or a statistical blip is a question the data cannot yet answer. In Flint, the water crisis that began in 2014, when the city, under emergency management, switched its water supply to the Flint River without proper corrosion control, leaching lead from aging pipes into the drinking water of 100,000 residents, became a national scandal. It was a failure that could only have happened in a city that had lost so much population and so much revenue that its government had been taken over by a state-appointed manager. The crisis was not just a failure of infrastructure. It was the final bill for 50 years of decline. The Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula remain in many ways 2 different states sharing a single government. The UP is rural, sparsely populated, heavily forested, and culturally closer to northern Wisconsin and Minnesota than to Detroit or Grand Rapids. Its residents call themselves Upers, from UP, and refer to people from the Lower Peninsula as trolls, because they live below the bridge. The humor is affectionate, but the underlying reality is that the Upper Peninsula was never a natural part of Michigan. It was a consolation prize, tacked on in a deal over Toledo, and its connection to the rest of the state was, for more than a century, tenuous at best. The Mackinac Bridge made the physical connection, but the economic and cultural gap persists. The UP's economy today depends on tourism, timber, a modest mining sector, and the university in Houghton. Its population has been declining for decades. On the shore of Lake Superior, in the Upper Peninsula, the waves come in from the northwest across 200 miles of open water and break against sandstone cliffs that have been eroding for thousands of years. The cliffs at Pictured Rock, stained with mineral pigments, iron oxide red, copper green, manganese black, rise 200 feet above the waterline. The colors are the elements that made Michigan: iron, copper, the minerals that drew the miners, the industries that built the cities, the wealth that rose and fell and left behind. Along the lake shore and in the factory towns and in the streets of Detroit, the physical evidence of a state that always believed the next thing it made would be the thing that lasted. The lake does not stop. The ore boats still come through. The assembly lines, fewer now, still run. And the white pine, which was supposed to be gone forever, cut to the last tree, burned to the last stump, mourned in the histories as the great squandered inheritance of 19th century Michigan, is growing again, slowly, in the sandy soil of the northern counties, where nobody planted it and nobody expected it, coming back on its own.